All right, welcome to the second part of how I came to Eastern Orthodoxy. So, in the first video, I mentioned that I was part of the UPCI. Now, this isn't to say that the UPCI is full of like cultists who are committing like sacrifices on an altar and doing all this weird, crazy cultic stuff. They're not all cultic, but there's a lot of things that I found at issue with the UPCI, which caused me to leave. So the UPCI, the United Pentecostal Church International, is one of the earliest Oneness Pentecostal movements to exist. It came about after the Azusa Street revivals and the many revivals going on in the West Coast. And they actually were part of the Assemblies of God for a while before, I think 153 of them, or 163, it might have been 163 of them, members got formally excommunicated and kicked out of the Assemblies of God. And the reason why they were kicked out was because not only were they endorsing baptism in Jesus' name, so the Acts 2:38 command, they were endorsing straight modalism and the modalism heresy that we had to deal with back with Sabellius. With Oneness Pentecostals, it's important to recognize that they're not a monolith, just like Protestantism as a whole. There's the UPCI, Pentecostal Assemblies of the World. There's like smaller Oneness Pentecostal sects around the world as well. Some a lot more strict than others. But basically, you come down to this. Oneness Pentecostals claim that Trinitarianism is error or wrong, and that the true belief is that God is Father in heaven, Son on earth, and Spirit in the church. They hold to something called modalistic monarchianism, which is essentially just modalism, where they believe that the Father is God and Christ was the Word in his head. And then upon the incarnation of the Son, he left, and then the Father assumed the flesh, robing himself in flesh. And when Christ resurrected, he became the Spirit in the church, and somehow they're all God at the same time. Like, it really doesn't make any sense. It makes no sense. And that's the crux of Oneness theology. It does not make sense to begin with. It's very much Gnosticism wrapped up as Pentecostalism. There's also holiness standards. A lot of churches have kind of become more liberal with this. Historically, men and women had to dress very conservatively, which is ironic because what we define as conservative has changed throughout time. But for them, conservatism is like 1960s white collar man. Wears a suit, clean shaven face, short hair. Women are not actually permitted to cut their hair because cutting your hair is like viewing you as cutting away your glory from God or the veil that God has given you. Women are kind of just like told that wearing pants is masculine and therefore against holiness standards. So a lot of women end up wearing skirts and dresses, long skirts like that too. Like you might even see them, like they might wear something called snoga, which is like they got spandex, like leggings under that, but then they got like a long skirt over top. So it's very much a faith that's based on the outwardness, appearance, rather than the changing of the heart. But I'm still thankful that God took me through there, because even with the critiques, there's still things that I find Oneness Pentecostalism taught me. So Oneness Pentecostalism taught me basics of prayer, which is requesting to God. It also taught me the importance of a community. It also taught me the basics of the Bible, basic books of the Bible. It just what you'd find in many other Pentecostal sects, whether they're Trinitarian or not, you find reflected in here. However, you take what is good, you throw away what is not useful. So you take what is good, throw away what is not useful. So then that meant that I took what was good, which was the basis, the Bible, and the commandments that were taught, and I threw away everything else. Oneness theology, holiness standards, the Oneness church, and I moved into Western Protestantism. However, in my opinion, as much as I love my Protestant friends, Western Protestantism is a failing experiment. It is. It is absolutely failing. When I went to university, I finally understood why Protestantism was such a failing system, because it's a system that doesn't exist. It's a bunch of small churches who are trying to claim that they're the one church that Christ, founded, yet all of them disagree with each other. And I never saw this more until I took Reformation Europe studies in my final year of university, where my professor, who is very, very well learned, he's not a man of faith though, but very well learned, and I spoke to him a lot of times after the courses just because he was so good at his lectures. And I was like, I saw the history. The Reformation, as people like to call it, is not a reformation. There are many Reformation attempts to happen. Way before Martin Luther. Jan Hus was not necessarily a reformer himself, but he was I guess a prototype. But there's like the Peasant Revolt, and then you start to see things like Melanchthon and followers of Luther start to disagree with each other on like the Book of Concord and stuff like that. Like John Calvin was responsible for burning freaking Michael Servetus on the stake because he was a Unitarian. And then somehow Zwingli and Luther, who were probably good friends in college and before that, as soon as they graduate, they start having arguments and bickering with each other, and Luther starts damning people who don't believe in the Eucharist. And then the Anabaptists, who are the radical reformers who just came out of nowhere, are getting persecuted by both magisterial reformers and the Roman powers. So, so that's what I mean. Like, there's no sort of like true unity amongst these Protestant churches. They just keep reforming and breaking away from each other over and over again to a point where it's almost like their churches are bound to die because the members keep splitting up, either from liberalism, either from doctrinal disagreements. So yeah, like Protestantism just does not work. It's not working. And for the longest time, I thought to be Western was to be Protestant, which is why I started growing a deep resentment for the West as well. I started really feeling like the Western world and what it had to offer was not for me. Catholicism and its colonial history, Protestantism with not only its colonial history, but its failing history that's dying out in the West. And I'm sorry, the numbers do not lie. It is dying. The Episcopal churches, the Presbyterian churches, the Calvin Reformed churches, the United churches, the Baptist churches, they're dying. Evangelicalism might be growing, but from what I see, the people who are actually staying is not. It's very much, come through the door, but we don't care what happens once you leave. And I came to a crossroad where I was like, it's either I become a communist or I become Orthodox Christian. It's contradictory to each other. I can't be a communist Christian. That's a contradiction. It's contrary to each other. If you want to be a Christian, you have to be anti-communist because communism does not allow for religion to live. So through a resentment of the West came a love for the East. And I love the Eastern cultures. I love the Eastern mindset. The mindset of the East is very different than the Western capitalism. The Western mindset has always been kind of like capitalistic in its way. It's always like if there's a will, there's a way. You have to do it. You have to do something if it's possible. Whereas the East is kind of like, you know what? Leave up to God. Let God sort it out. Because God isn't just this distant being. God is above beings. God is what creates and continuously sustains the cosmos through his uncreated energies. But then also, when I look at the evangelical churches and the Western churches, they kind of follow that problem where everyone is a heretic. But then when everyone's a heretic, who's not? Or who actually is a heretic then? If everyone's a heretic, who actually is a heretic? We have people calling Mike Todd a false teacher. We have people calling Stephen Furtick a false teacher. It's like, I can't call him a false teacher. He's not part of my church. So I don't have to deal with that problem. Or people saying Hillsong and like Transformation and Elevation and all these mega churches are compromised and there's wolves in sheep's clothing. But it's like, why don't you guys actually do something about it? Why don't you actually try to reform these churches like your Protestant ancestors did before you? Why don't you try to attempt that? Everyone's complacent in it. No one's actually trying to do anything. Or, but Lecrae, by the way, I still love Lecrae. Lecrae is a compromised Christian rapper. He's not an actual Christian. It's like, okay, why don't you guys do something about the industry? Why do you still support the same capitalistic industry that supports secular music? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Where do you draw the boundaries? If understanding the Bible is based off of your own interpretation and trying to be on a moral high ground because you know who's a false teacher and who's not, but you don't do anything to change. You constantly join and leave all these different churches in an attempt to find the right evangelical process church for you, but you always have your complaints. So then I was like, I'm tired. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is insanity. And that's why I went Eastern Orthodox. Eastern Orthodox solved those problems for me. I don't have to worry about who's a false teacher because I don't need to listen to other priests. There's amazing priests. There's probably bad priests. I can't call them good or bad priests. I can't call them heretics either. It's not my job. I'm a layperson. I'm to follow my spiritual father. I'm to follow my bishop. I'm to follow the Orthodox Church. But I don't have to worry about, this church is doing this church is doing that. It's not concerning me. So yeah, that wraps up the two-parter on how I became Eastern Orthodox and why I became Eastern Orthodox. If you have questions, feel free to DM me. Feel free to DM the page. I'd love to have a conversation. But yeah, see you on the next project, whatever that be. I hope you guys like the next documentary. I think it's going to be a very nice one.